night, and welcome to Reflection Night Sessions podcast. If you're still awake at this hour, your mind is probably carrying a little more than usual. Let's sit with one thought for a while. Most of us spend our lives inside our own minds without ever stopping to ask a simple question. Is everything I think meant to be believed? We grow up learning how to use our minds to solve problems, to plan, to analyze, to decide. But no one really teaches us how to step back from thought itself. So the mind slowly becomes more than a tool. It becomes a narrator, a judge, sometimes even an authority. We don't notice this shift when life is busy. During the day, there's too much noise, too many tasks, too many roles to play, but at night, things change. At night, there's nothing left to distract us from our own thoughts. No urgency, no performance, no audience. And that's when many people realize something unsettling. The mind doesn't calm down when the day ends. It speeds up. It reviews what you said, what you should have said, what might happen next, what could go wrong, what you're behind on. And because these thoughts arrive quietly, in your own voice, they feel trustworthy. We rarely ask whether they deserve that trust. We just listen. But listening is not the same as understanding, and hearing a thought doesn't mean you have to follow it. This is where most of our inner tension begins, not because the mind is broken, but because we've been relating to it in only one way: belief. Tonight isn't about stopping thoughts or fixing the mind or replacing negative thinking with positive thinking. It's about something much simpler and much harder. Learning to see the mind as something you use, not something you obey. And that distinction becomes very clear at this hour. If you're listening to this right now, it's probably not because you're looking for answers. It's because your mind is still active even though the day is already over. At night, the world gets quieter, but the mind often does the opposite. It starts talking more, thinking more, replaying more, and most of us were taught to listen to it, to trust it, to believe that whatever shows up in our thoughts must be important, meaningful, or true. Tonight, I want to challenge that assumption, not in an aggressive way, not by rejecting thinking itself, but by questioning a habit so common we almost never notice it. The idea is simple, but uncomfortable. The mind was meant to be used, not trusted. That sentence sounds sharp at first, almost disrespectful, but it isn't anti-intelligence, it's pro-awareness. The mind is an incredible tool. It calculates, it plans, it imagines possibilities, it connects patterns. But the mind has one priority above all else: predicting and protecting. It does not exist to tell you the truth. It exists to keep you safe, or at least feeling safe. That's why it exaggerates risk. That's why it replays mistakes. That's why it creates worst-case scenarios even when nothing is actually happening. The mind feels silence because silence feels unsafe to it. And because the mind speaks in your own voice, its messages feel personal, authoritative, convincing. So we confuse familiarity with reliability. We assume that because a thought feels close, it must be accurate. But the mind is fast, not wise, efficient, not objective. It is designed to react, not to reflect. There is a crucial difference between using the mind and trusting it. Using the mind means I hear this thought, but I will examine it. Trusting the mind means this thought appeared, so it must be right. Most suffering happens in that second sentence, when anxiety becomes prophecy, when doubt becomes identity, when one thought becomes a story about who you are. Think about how often your mind tells you you're late. You should have figured this out by now. This is going to end badly. and how rarely it says, let's slow down and check the facts. The mind does not pause by default. It moves forward endlessly. If you do not use it deliberately, it will use you automatically. Here's the part most people avoid. Trusting the mind is comfortable because if the mind is in control, then responsibility is softened. I reacted because I felt anxious. I couldn't help it. That's just how I think. My mind wouldn't let me do anything else. These explanations feel reasonable, but they quietly remove agency. Using the mind does the opposite. It creates a pause, and in that pause, you become responsible again. Responsible for your tone, your reactions, your choices. That's not pleasant, but it's honest. And honesty is rarely comfortable at first. Night reveals the truth about the mind. When distractions fade, when performance ends, when there is nothing left to manage or impress, the mind becomes louder. Not because it is smarter at night, but because there is no competition. It brings unfinished conversations, imagined futures, old regrets dressed up as insights. If you trust the mind at night, sleep becomes negotiation. Rest becomes impossible. If you use the mind, the same thoughts still appear, but they lose their authority. You stop following every thread. You listen without obeying. That is not suppression. That is discernment. Many people believe peace comes from stopping thoughts. That is a mistake. Thoughts don't need to disappear. They just need to stop being believed automatically. Clarity does not come from control, it comes from distance. When you see thoughts as events, not commands, something shifts. You realize, hey, I'm not my thoughts. I'm the one noticing them. That realization is subtle, but it changes everything. Because once you see the mind as a tool, you can put it down, even briefly. The mind was never meant to be your judge, or your enemy, or your guide through every moment of life. It was meant to assist, not to rule. When you trust the mind completely, you live inside its noise. Right? When you use it wisely, you regain silence without forcing it. So tonight, if your thoughts feel heavy, don't try to fix them. Don't argue with them. Don't follow them. Just notice without belief. Notice without resistance. That small act is already enough. Because the mind does not need to be trusted to be useful. It only needs to be seen clearly. The mind was never meant to be your judge or your enemy, or the voice that decides what your life means. It was meant to assist, to calculate, to organize, to imagine possibility. But somewhere along the way, we gave it authority it never asked for. We let it define our limits, our fears, our sense of timing, even our sense of self. And the strange part is, most of the time, we don't even notice this happening. We don't say, my mind is taking over. We say, I'm just thinking. But there is a difference. Thinking is an action. Believing every thought is a habit, and habits shape lives quietly. When you trust the mind completely, you live inside its interpretations. You move according to its alarms. You react to its projections. When you use the mind instead, you create space. Space between a thought and a reaction. Space between fear and action. Space between impulse and choice. That space may feel small at first, almost invisible, but that space is where freedom begins. Not dramatic freedom, not loud freedom, but the quiet kind. The kind that lets you pause before replying. The kind that lets you sleep without solving everything. The kind that lets you exist without constantly explaining yourself to your own thoughts. Tonight, you don't need to silence the mind. You don't need to improve it. You don't need to fix anything. Just don't hand it the microphone. Let it speak, but don't let it decide. Notice the thoughts that pass through. Notice how convincing they sound. Notice how temporary they actually are. And then let them move on. You are not here to control the mind. You are here to see it clearly. Because the moment you stop trusting every thought, life becomes a little lighter. Not easier, but clearer. And clarity, especially at night, is enough. Okay, that's all for tonight. Thank you for staying with me. This was the Reflection Night Sessions podcast. Until next time, take care. Good night.